Hello everyone, welcome back. This week we're talking about measurement and instruments. Up to this point we've talked about basically the theoretical aspects of research in terms of why we do social work research, the ethics of social work research, cultural competence of social work research, doing a review of the literature, which is really the first action step that we take when we're beginning research. And part of what we do when we're reviewing the literature is we're actually reviewing about different variables for the topic that we're interested in. So this week we're going to examine variables, levels of measurement, and measurement instruments, which is the next step when you're designing a research study. So let's talk about levels of measurement. And we're going to step back a little bit to chapter 6, and we're going to actually review about what variables are. And then we'll talk about the levels of measurement and move forward from there. Okay, so let's take a step back and let's talk about what a variable actually is. And chapter 6 talked about this, so go back and reread that if you need to. But a variable is a concept, or a concept that has characteristics that can take on different attributes. And like in the book, he uses the concept of ethnicity. And ethnicity can take off the different attributes in terms of Asian, Caucasian, Latino, African American, Native American. There's different attributes of a variable. And the key about a variable is it's a concept that's going to change among participants, among the population. It has to vary, and then it has to have different attributes that will vary. Depending on those attributes, all variables can be measured at one or more levels of measurement. And when we talk about levels of measurement, this actually becomes important in understanding this, so that when you start doing an analysis and a statistical analysis to understand your data, you have to understand the level that the variable is measured at. And when you're deciding the study and designing it, you want to know what level to measure your variables at, because as the research designer, as the researcher, you're actually going to make those decisions along the way. So let's talk about the different levels of measurement. And again, a variable is something that varies between research participants. If the attributes of the variable do not change between research participants, it's considered a constant. An example of this is gender is a variable. And we'll take it very simply and say gender can be male or female. So it has two attributes, and it can actually vary among a population and among a sample population, unless your research participants are only females. Maybe they're only females who have had children. Then gender is not a variable. It is a constant, because it doesn't change in your sample population. Everybody's a female. For it to be a variable, it has to change among the participants. Now, variables are measured at 4 levels. We have a nominal level, an ordinal level, an interval level, and a ratio level. At the nominal, the variables are whose attributes are measured in kind. And the nominal includes things like gender, political party affiliation, ethnicity, geographic region. It's almost like it's a noun that you're going to be measuring. If it's an ordinal level, then you measure variables whose attributes can be rank ordered. And these often are the Likert scales, 1 being completely dissatisfied, 5 being totally satisfied. Interval is when the distance or the interval separating the variable has meaning. And this is at the point where you can actually do some mathematical computations with your data. The nominal, the ordinal level is really more just counting what's there. The interval level, the ratio level, begins using some of the statistical terms that we'll study next semester, the statistical test. Ratio is when a variable has a true zero. An example of a ratio variable would be if you wanted to measure delinquent behavior. Has this child been charged with a delinquent behavior? No. So there's an absence of there's a true zero there, and there's an absence of that variable or an absence of that attribute. In behavioral sciences, though, we tend to categorize interval ratio together. So oftentimes you'll hear us refer to nominal, ordinal, interval ratio, with interval ratio / being together, because we don't necessarily get into the level of where it's concerning that we have a true zero. Your hard sciences like medicine, physics, and things like that will distinguish more between the interval ratio levels. But just understand that we have nominal, ordinal, interval ratio. The difference between interval ratio is if there is a true 0 point or not. So let's break this down and look at some examples to help make this clearer. Again, the nominal level, this can include the ethnicity, gender, political party affiliation, eye color. It's almost like it's just a noun that you're counting. Ordinal level, Likert scales, rankings from 1 to 5. Categories of income or ages if they're categorized, and that means like in the example in the book, if you have annual income from $12,500 to $25,000, $25,000 to $32,000. When you categorize and you have a rank order, something's higher, something's lower, then it's going to be ordinal level. Interval level, again, you can actually do some mathematical computations between the intervals because they have meaning. Standardized measures such as IQ scores, stress scores, some of those will actually have meaning to them, and so it's an interval level, and that means you can actually do more statistical analysis with that. And again, the ratio level is the same as interval, except there's a true 0. So you can ask how many times a person has been in jail. 0. So there's a true 0 there. So why is it even important that we measure variables? We measure because we need to describe. So the purpose of measuring a variable is to be able to describe it completely and accurately. So if we want to be able to describe the ethnicity of our sample population or the ethnicity of the clients that we see, or we want to have an understanding of religious affiliation of a group of individuals, we need to be able to define that in a way that it can be counted accurately. The actual process of defining a variable so it can be measured is called operationalizing it, or operationalization. So you're going to hear this term used as you move forward in research. We will say we're operationalizing a variable, and that means we're making it measurable. We're taking it from the general definition or just a general description of it, and we're going to make it measurable. We can do that virtually with just about anything. From the positive perspective, the approach is that if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. So even if you're talking about morality, if you're talking about faith, if you're talking about love, if you're talking about some of those very abstract terms, there are some ways that those have been defined so that they can be measured. Now, it doesn't mean we all agree on the measurement, but there are some ways that they have been operationalized and therefore can be quantified. And then that's what we do when we start describing variables. And these are the reasons why it's important, why we need to describe variables in research. The first one is because of correspondence, and we want to make sure that we're going to describe the variables and make them measurable so that we can provide a link, again, between those abstract theoretical concepts and measurement. It's really about measurement. It's really about quantifying these in an objective manner. Standardization is when the variable is measured in a way that everyone's measuring it the same and will assign the same meaning to it. So this happens usually when you use standardized instruments, and we're going to talk about that in the next chapter, but that's what happens here. There's a standardization of it. Now, we often measure depression, anxiety, stress, those type of things in our clients. And there can be 100 different measures for anxiety, but any of them that we choose has been standardized. If we're choosing one standardized instrument to measure anxiety, and another agency is choosing the same instrument to measure anxiety, then we're assigning the same meaning to anxiety. So even though there's multiple instruments out there, when we choose one, then whoever uses the same instrument assigns the same meaning and measures it in the same way. So this is what standardization means. Again, quantification, that means that we actually are putting numbers to these concepts, to these attributes. We can use the numbers in statistics, and statistics is simply the tool we use to search for meaningful relationships between variables. We take these abstract theoretical concepts, okay? We operationalize them or make them measurable, make them observable. We standardize it so that if I'm measuring anxiety and you're using the same instrument I use, then you're measuring anxiety and defining it in the same way I am. And then we quantify it. So then we can actually assign numbers to it and then perform statistical analysis to look for those relationships. So this is the research process, and then this is where the measurement comes into it. And again, we go back to duplication. We talked about being able to duplicate studies as opposed to replication, but duplication means that we want to confirm a first researcher's results by doing the same thing again as much as it's possible under the same conditions. And to do that, we actually have to have that standardization and quantification of the variables. Otherwise, we're not duplicating, we're not measuring the same thing if we're not using the same standardized, quantified measurement of the variable that the first researcher did. All of these go together to demonstrate why we need to measure variables. How we measure them is often the researcher's choice. We can do it at a nominal level, an ordinal level, an interval level, or a ratio level. And just an aside note, if you're actually designing a research study and you're choosing a way to measure your variables, to operationalize those, always try to measure them at the highest level possible, meaning always try to measure them at an interval ratio level, if at all possible, because when it comes time to do the statistical analysis, you're able to perform more statistical tests, more rigorous statistical tests to provide better descriptions of any relationships between variables. If you're collecting things at a nominal and ordinal level, you have less tools available to you to do statistical analysis. That will make more sense when we start understanding statistics, but just know that it's a great rule of thumb to always capture your variables at the highest level possible when you're designing a research study. We know we have to operationalize variables. We know we actually have to make them standardized and quantifiable, but actually how do we measure them? What's the how-to here? And so we really need a measuring instrument to measure them with. And some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves when we're choosing the measuring instrument we're going to use. So there are several questions a researcher must answer to determine what measuring instrument to select. We're going to go over these in the next PowerPoint lecture, Measuring Instruments.